I'm Melissa McEuen. I'm a professor of history at Transylvania University, and I'm very happy to be here tonight with the McCracken County Public Library. And I appreciate Bobby Wrinkle inviting me to participate in this Women's History Month event 2021. Women's History Month began, as some of you may remember, the 1980s. It started out as Women's History Week in 1982. And it was the result of a US congressional resolution that authorized and requested that the president proclaim the Week of Recognition. And this continued for 5 years. Then in 1987, after being petitioned by the National Women's History Project, Congress passed a resolution designating the month of March as Women's History Month. And it has been a celebratory month ever since, made so typically by presidential proclamation. And these proclamations highlight the contributions women have made to the United States, and they recognize the specific achievements in a variety of fields. So we are in the middle of Women's History Month right now. My talk tonight will focus on Kentucky women. And as you probably saw in the publicity for the talk, women working in the areas of public health, social justice, education, politics, and cultural development. Women who made their communities safer, healthier, and more equitable places to live. Most of the stories that I'll share tonight come out of the book Kentucky Women, Their Lives and Times, an anthology of 17 essays by 17 writers. These essays span the long history of Kentucky, as well as its vast geography. Tonight, however, I plan to focus on just a few of the women who are featured in these essays, most of them working in the 20th century, with a couple of exceptions, but most of them worked in the 20th century. I had the good fortune to build and co-edit this anthology with my good friend and colleague, Dr. Thomas Appleton, now Professor Emeritus at Eastern Kentucky University. This book that Tom and I co-edited is one in a series on Southern women, published by the University of Georgia Press. You can find volumes on Virginia women, Georgia women, Texas women, South Carolina women, etc. They're all in paperback. They're easy to carry to the beach or to the park, or as I do, take one in my tiny little garden and read. And each one of these volumes contains life and times stories, biographies. So if you love women's history or Southern history or just a good biography, these are wonderful collections to dig into. Now, before I introduce a few Kentucky women from the past, I want to say that I came away from working on this project absolutely astounded by Kentucky's dynamic, diverse, and progressive past. And you heard that right, progressive past, made so in large part by its women. We all need to remind ourselves how central women were and are in the economic development, the political development, and the cultural development of Kentucky, and how widespread their influence was, not just in Kentucky or even regionally, but nationally. And I'll introduce a couple of those women tonight who were known internationally as well. You know, every time there's talk of putting a statue of a woman in the Capitol Rotunda in Frankfurt, Madeleine McDowell Breckenridge's name is at or near the top of the list. And why? Because she did perhaps more than any other Kentucky woman to mobilize opinion and Kentucky politicians to support the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote. And she did it all in a race against time because she was in poor health. Afflicted with tuberculosis of the bone, she had to have a foot amputated when she was 24 years old. Yet that did not stop her. She crossed the state and the nation giving speeches about why women needed to vote. She was the great-granddaughter of Henry Clay. She grew up at Ashland in Lexington. Here's a contemporary photo of Ashland, where she grew up. It's now a historic house in downtown Lexington and a park. And she felt compelled, like her great-grandfather, to use her life and energy for good. She could easily have spent her life giving teas, garden parties, but she was driven just like her clay ancestor. And like him, she knew how to argue, she knew how to compromise. And one of the things that I find most interesting about Madge Breckenridge is that she didn't think Kentucky should compare itself to Southern states in terms of progress, but instead should look up and out nationally for comparisons. Madge was highly respected by leaders of the National American Woman Suffrage Association and spoke on their behalf and invited members of the National Association to come to Kentucky and speak. And they knew that she was crucial to the national success of women getting the right to vote. Now, voting for women was not Madge's only cause. She was involved in many other causes. I've listed just a few of them here. And I want to read to you from the Kentucky Women book, just a short, very short passage by Dr. Lindsay Apple, who wrote the essay on Madge Breckenridge. Here's what he wrote about Madge. She revolutionized education, limited child labor, and helped to create a juvenile justice system. Lobbying for better health care, particularly in the treatment of tuberculosis, a disease that had reached epidemic proportions in the Commonwealth, brought her national recognition. Through all these reforming efforts, she demanded more responsible and responsive government. And she revealed an eye for detail that few male politicians had shown. So how did Madge do it? How did she go about it? What were her methods? I'm currently teaching a class on American women in activism, and my students and I are looking at methods that women used, especially in the early 20th century. And what about those women working with her? Here's what they did. They were field workers. They went out and collected evidence. They determined what the problems were by gathering lots of data. They knew how to crunch the numbers. They knew how to talk to people. They interviewed people. They observed. They educated the public. And Madge not only gave numerous speeches, she wrote a regular column for the Lexington newspaper. Now, it didn't hurt that her husband ran that newspaper and let her publish what she wanted to publish. These women, like Madge, also educated government officials, and Madge reminded those officials of their duties as public servants. One of the things that I've listed here, and really I would say probably her first cause, the thing that got her into public service and into activism, was her disgust, her absolute disgust with lawlessness among public officials. Central Kentucky, in Frankfort, she couldn't stand the political corruption, the greed in the highest places, guys walking around the Capitol with weapons for shooting each other. We know there was an assassination of a governor and many other politically inspired murders. And this is really what got Madge's ire up and got her to moving in the direction as a public activist. She really thought women needed to get involved to try to temper some of that lawlessness among state officials in Frankfort and officials, in this case, in her hometown of Lexington. Madge did get to vote once the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920. In November of 1920, she voted, and then just a few days later died. But she got to see her great cause of women's suffrage actually be successful. If you want to read more about women's suffrage, there's a great new book out. And since this is a library program, I did want to recommend some books. Melanie Beals Goan's new book, A Simple Justice, is absolutely riveting. I mean, it really is a page turner about the long struggle, the decades-long struggle waged by Kentucky women to gain and keep the right to vote. And I say, and keep the right to vote, because Kentucky women were granted school suffrage in the 1890s. And when they turned out in droves to vote in school elections, and many Black women turned out to vote in school elections. Well, there was some hesitation on the part of city officials, state officials, who decided maybe women shouldn't have the right to school suffrage after all, and took that back. They rescinded it. So this story that Melanie Beals Goan tells, it's a very contemporary story too, about those who are granted the right to vote and then it's taken away. You know, we've watched voter suppression in recent years, the various attempts to challenge people's right to vote, and very often people in marginal populations having that vote challenged, taken away, gerrymandered away, their political power gerrymandered away. And certainly that's what happened to Kentucky women in the 1890s. So keeping the right to vote just as important as earning the right to vote or getting it. Now, another Kentucky woman who spent her adult life as an activist, not in Kentucky, but in Chicago, was Sofinisba Breckenridge. She took her sense of duty and reforming spirit and joined a large community of activist women in Chicago, women who were social workers, lawyers, factory inspectors, child development experts, educational policy experts. Many of them women in the new fields of social science. Another one was home economics and domestic science. Nisba was devoted to and worked for decades with her life partner, Edith Abbott. Edith's research yielded a 19-volume report on women working in industry. They are particularly interested in women who are being abused in factories, women who are getting hurt in factories, and they're gathering information in order to lobby state legislators on protections for women who were working. The special challenges faced by women and children were at the heart of what Edith and Nisba were doing collaboratively, along with their many friends and colleagues in Chicago, Jane Addams at Hull House, and Grace Habit, and Florence Kelly, and many activist women, including those who were living in poverty-stricken neighborhoods, trying to help new immigrants in the city, first-generation Americans, and doing much the same as Madge did, you know, collecting data, observing, crunching the numbers, interviewing people, trying to find solutions. And again, lobbying government officials at the city level, at the state level, and at the federal level to get legislation passed. And I don't have time tonight to talk about all of the things that Sofinisba Breckenridge was involved in. But if you look at this list, child labor legislation, protections for women workers, compulsory public education, housing for the poor, foster care, and on. I really want to emphasize here that Nisba and so many of her fellow activists saw the interconnected nature of these various issues. They thought, for example, if school attendance was required by the state, then fewer children would be in factories and in mines. If tenement housing were more secure with clean water, fewer children would die of communicable disease. So public health, green spaces, parks, elementary education, all of these are linked for these reforming women, protecting and nurturing children. This is central to their work. And, you know, I included the last bullet point, their interest in, and especially Sofinisba's interest in having a part in the Social Security Act, which was passed in 1935, having a part that recognized children, dependent children's needs. You know, today we think of Social Security primarily as a retirement program, but that's not entirely its purpose in the 1930s when it was passed. You know, my father lost both of his parents to tuberculosis when he was a boy. At age 12, he was an orphan. It was 1945. And he and his 8-year-old brother were taken in by a saint of a woman, an absolute saint. And she received a small Social Security check to help support her in rearing those two little boys. That wouldn't have been possible if it had happened 10 or 11 years earlier. So I just want to point that out. Sofinisba Breckenridge works for years with other women to get the recognition of children by the federal government. And it comes out in the Social Security Act. Now, one of Kentucky's great unsung heroes is Linda Neville. Linda Neville's story in the book, Kentucky Women, is told wonderfully by Professor Dwayne Boland of Murray State University, recently retired from Murray State University. Those of you in Western Kentucky likely know Dr. Boland. Well, Linda Neville is pictured here on the right. She devoted her life to the treatment and eradication of trachoma. Today, the CDC defines trachoma as the world's leading cause of preventable blindness due to infectious disease. In 1907, trachoma was a scourge in Kentucky, affecting about 33,000 Kentuckians. In Eastern Kentucky, where Neville visited friends, she saw so many of all ages suffering from trachoma. And trachoma is largely caused by people using shared wash basins. So you can imagine homes without running water. There's one wash basin. Everyone in the family, mom, dad, 6 or 7 children, wash their faces with the same water. So they're, throwing that water upon their faces. The next person comes, throws the water upon their face, washing their faces with the same water. Now, it's also spread by flies crawling in and around the eyes and nose. So Linda Neville took this cause upon herself. She mobilized, she raised funds, she helped educate individuals about the importance of using separate wash basins, kind of basic hygiene. And she arranged for those who were afflicted to see eye doctors and specialists to treat them. She was so well known in Lexington for her work that a piece of mail reached her written in a child's hand. A little boy sent her a thank you note written in pencil, and he addressed the envelope simply, "The lady who helps blind children see, Lexington, Kentucky." And it reached her. We know this because Linda Neville kept that envelope, and it's in her papers at the University of Kentucky libraries. Much due to Neville's tenacity, trachoma had been completely eradicated in Kentucky by 1952. Another Kentucky woman, not as well known as she should be, is Elizabeth Faust, the leader of several clubs and organizations, president of the Kentucky Association of Colored Women, and a national officer in the National Association of Colored Women. She was active in her Baptist church congregation, a founder of a YWCA branch in Lexington, and many of her commitments, Faust's commitments, were with interracial groups, the United Council of Church Women and the Southern Regional Council, for example. She was tireless in her work building relationships between Blacks and whites in Lexington. And she especially felt the need to cross class lines within the African American community to conduct what was known at the time as uplift work among poor Blacks and working class Blacks. In the Kentucky Women book, historian Karen McDaniel, a retired librarian at Kentucky State University, wrote about Faust's activism surrounding one particular event. And I want to describe that event to you. I've put it in a little thumbnail sketch here, but I want to give you more details. On an April night in 1925, Gertrude Boulder left her workplace to walk home, and shortly thereafter was found lying on a Lexington street where she had collapsed. The local police arrested her, charged her with drunkenness, and put her in a jail cell. Although she appeared to be sick, the police did not seek medical attention for Gertrude Boulder, and Gertrude died a few hours later. The news of their friend and fellow club member and fellow church member, her death, mobilized Lexington's Black club women. And immediately following her funeral, Elizabeth Faust organized a meeting among these women to discuss how they should respond to their friend's death. More than 80 female community members came together, signed a petition that was published the next day in the Lexington Herald and also in the Lexington Leader, two main newspapers. And at the top of the petition was Elizabeth Faust's name. The petition that they wrote not only defended Gertrude Boulder's character, but it also noted her political activism and civic engagement. For example, she'd been a poll worker in local elections. The petition also chastised the police for their treatment of Boulder and suggested ways that future cases should be handled. Elizabeth Faust also presented copies of her petition to the mayor, the Commission of Public Safety, and the chief of police. And the result was an immediate investigation into the Boulder incident and into her death. By the way, she was not drunk. She was suffering from a gastrointestinal problem. Well, the investigation proceeded, and soon thereafter, an official report was made public that restored Gertrude Boulder's character. Didn't restore her life, but her character. It publicly offered sympathy to the Boulder family, and it introduced a citywide change in how prisoners were handled. Going forward, police had to seek medical attention for sick inmates, and if necessary, transport them to the hospital. Elizabeth Faust was crossing the color line at significant risk, I might add, to demand accountability and reform in law enforcement. It was going to help all who were arrested or incarcerated. And she, like Madge Breckenridge, was demanding responsible and responsive government. Now I'm going to shift here. Most of the women I've talked about, reformers, many of them from the progressive era, many of them volunteers, not paid for what they're doing, but spending their time, many, many hours volunteering for various causes and traveling across the country on their own dime to give speeches and spending their time writing papers, newspapers and others. And then there are the Kentucky women who decide to become part of the government, to run for elective office. And there are many, but I'm just going to point to a couple of them. We all know that today, women who are in public office in Kentucky. The first woman and the first African-American woman elected to the Kentucky Senate was Georgia Davis Powers. She served for 21 years. She had worked in politics in Frankfort before she decided to run for office. She knew how Frankfort operated. She had organized the March on Frankfort for Civil Rights, which had brought the headliners Martin Luther King Jr. and Jackie Robinson to Frankfort. She was known in the General Assembly as a tough negotiator. And there are lots of, you can watch a number of interviews with Georgia Davis Powers. They're available on YouTube. Great story that Renee Shaw did on Georgia Powers in the last years of her life, actually. Georgia Davis Powers kept her eye on issues that would help women, people of color, the poor, blue-collar workers, and labor in general. She, for example, fought against right-to-work laws, which weakened or killed labor unions. She advocated for a higher minimum wage, but she's probably best known for the anti-discrimination in housing legislation that she introduced. And this was still a very serious problem when she entered the Senate. People who owned buildings could simply not rent apartments to someone who was a person of color. They could refuse to sell a house to someone they didn't want to sell to, strictly based on race. And so Georgia Davis Powers is successful in her arguments about fair housing and trying to break down the discriminatory barriers to housing in Kentucky. I would invite you to read Dr. Carolyn Dupont's essay on Georgia Davis Powers and Kentucky women, because it's inspiring and she fought tirelessly. I think I've used the word tireless a lot in this talk, but she is one of those people completely devoted and lived a very long life as an activist. You know, one of the things I put on this slide was that she fought the Kentucky General Assembly's campaign to rescind the ERA, which, I mean, I won't go into that into great detail, but, you know, the Kentucky General Assembly in the early 70s actually ratified the Equal Rights Amendment. And then a few years later, rescinded it. And often when I'm talking to students about rights and, rights that are granted, we talk about the fact that for some of us, those rights are tenuous, especially if you are in a marginalized community, those rights can be easily taken away. And so we can't kind of rest on our laurels and think that, once we have the vote, we can always keep the vote. Once we have a right, it's granted in the law, we will always have that right. We've got to kind of keep fighting and keep our eye on the ball, especially on those who may be trying to take those rights away from us. And while I can't, as I said, talk about all of the women who have served Kentucky in elective office, here are just a few working in the activist traditions that I have introduced tonight. Fighting for working people and laborers. Here in the upper left corner is Delma Stovall. She first rose in the ranks of her tobacco workers union and would eventually hold several public offices in the Commonwealth and become Kentucky's lieutenant governor, where she served in the late 70s. In the lower left, here's Kentucky's current lieutenant governor, Jacqueline Coleman, public school teacher and a basketball coach and a fierce advocate for public education in the state. As was Kentucky's first and to date only woman governor, Madeleine Collins. She began as a high school teacher in the public schools, teaching home economics, but eventually got involved in political campaigns as a volunteer. And as governor from 1983 to 87, Collins had a robust public education plan, and she sought to strengthen the state's economy by inviting Toyota manufacturing to locate here. And as you may know, Toyota chose Kentucky, much due to Governor Collins's savvy and diplomacy, and I would add her cultural awareness. And I want to read to you just a short bit, something she said about the campaign to bring Toyota to Kentucky in that competition. She familiarized herself with Japan's history and culture before making her initial visit to Japan, a decision she credited to her Baptist upbringing. I'm reading from Professor John Paul Hill's essay on Madeleine Collins. This is Governor Collins speaking. Here's what she said. In the Baptist church, you study a lot about missionaries that go to these foreign countries. You learn about the geography and terrain of a country. You learn about their food and clothes and what happens in their homes. That's her quotation. And again, 20 states competed for the Toyota plant, and Kentucky won that thanks to Governor Collins and her cultural awareness, her diplomatic skill, and her willingness to be the person who would, in fact, meet the Japanese on a level where they needed to be met. She once said that when the Japanese officials came to Kentucky, she did not send somebody from her office to meet them, but she went out to the airport, personally met them to let them know how important this was to her. And finally, up in the top right corner is Attica Scott, one of the young activist legislators in the Kentucky Assembly. Her focus has been on maternal health care and infant health. She points to the high maternal mortality rates, even higher, of course, in Black communities in the United States. And Scott has been on the front lines of protests calling for justice and reckoning for Breonna Taylor, who died at the hands of Louisville police just over a year ago on March 13th. Attica Scott is working in the tradition of Elizabeth Faust and so many women calling out municipal government, its leadership, its agencies for neglect and for lawlessness. And again, these are just a few of the many activist women who have worked or are working today on behalf of families, children, public schools, workers, the state economy, public health, and many more issues. And I know that you all know so many more women like this. Now, the last segment of my talk tonight contains two stories, one deep in Eastern Kentucky, the other all the way across the state in Western Kentucky. And these are stories about culture. During the depths of the Depression, President Franklin Roosevelt and his brain trust came up with a lot of ideas that had to do with recovery, relief, reform, employment. And one of the biggest programs for employment to try to help ease the high unemployment rate during the Great Depression was the Works Progress Administration. We all know that the WPA built roads and bridges and schools and courthouses. I rode by a WPA courthouse twice a day, every day. I was in school in Caldwell County, a beautiful WPA courthouse. But the WPA did more than build American infrastructure. It also built culture. And one of the most unique programs that the WPA had was something called the Packhorse Library in Kentucky. In 1935, library service in Kentucky was extremely limited. 63% of the state's residents had no public library facilities. So this project, the Kentucky Packhorse Library Project, hired women almost exclusively to be what were called carriers of books, magazines, and other educational materials to people's homes, to schools, and to community centers. The carriers rode on horses or mules. They picked up materials from their county headquarters, and each one traveled 3 or 4 different routes a week. They usually covered about 18 miles a day, delivering these books and magazines and other materials. Many of the books had been donated, a number of them from outside Kentucky. There was a woman in Pittsburgh who thought this program, unique as it was fascinating. She donated a lot of materials to the Kentucky Packhorse Library. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt was very impressed with the project. She came to Eastern Kentucky in 1937 to observe the work of the Packhorse librarians. And the program served 31 counties, most of them in Eastern Kentucky. I think probably the farthest west that the Packhorse Library came was Barron County. But again, the central focus was in Eastern Kentucky. I've got another picture. Here are the Packhorse carriers. They've met at their local center there in Knott County to collect their materials and are getting ready to go out for the day on their routes. This is in Hindman in Knott County. Now we're going to move all the way over to Western Kentucky. And finally, tonight, I want to introduce you to Nancy Newsom of Princeton. And again, we're talking about culture here. Nancy is an internationally recognized expert on the production of dry cured ham, or what we know as country ham. In producing her award-winning hams, Nancy follows a recipe that the Newsom family brought with them to Kentucky in the early 1800s. And she continues to cure pork as many rural Southerners did for generations. She appreciates tradition and a preservation process that has nearly disappeared in the South. She could generate more profit if she abandoned the all-natural curing process. That's a decision that most U.S. ham producers made decades ago. But Nancy is committed to helping contemporary Southerners and others understand and appreciate what their ancestors ate, known today as heritage foods. I have this in the slide. There's a heritage food movement. So if you read Southern Living magazine or Garden and Gun magazine, you've no doubt seen Newsom featured in those pages. She's won many prizes and awards nationally and internationally, and she has shared the stage and tables with such renowned chefs as Alice Waters and Edward Lee and Kathy Carey. Those are just a few. I was thrilled to be able to write the essay on Nancy Newsom. And not just because we grew up together in Princeton, but I wanted to learn the secret of curing ham, a lost art, Nancy calls it. And I'll tell you that the key ingredients are salt, hickory smoke, and thyme. And that last one's very important. It also helps to have really cold winters and really hot summers. It's the microclimate in this upper South area, Kentucky, Virginia, a little bit of Tennessee, where ham can be cured naturally it's the microclimate. Again, really cold winters and really hot summers. My essay is based on interviews that Nancy so generously agreed to. She also made available to me some papers that hadn't been seen by other writers, mainly the journalists who have written about her widely. Nancy's not only a successful and hardworking entrepreneur, but she's also been a leader in small town economic development and revitalization, contributing 25 years ago to a Main Street program that really helped bring tourists to Princeton and to her store, which is on Main Street. So preserving, sharing, and celebrating rural Kentucky foodways is Nancy Newsom's contribution to Southern culture and American culture. And while the other women I have profiled tonight undertook the fight for women's suffrage or public education or fairness in housing or accountability in law enforcement or curing chronic disease, Nancy is preserving culture. And she promotes the role of Kentucky's culinary heritage to celebrate our past and keep this very special and unique tradition alive. And so I want to end with Nancy Newsom. So thank you for having me. I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have about these Kentucky women or others.
How did you pick the women that you talked to us about tonight? Because you had 17 or more to pick from.
I did. I decided to choose women who were primarily activists. I started out, I was thinking, oh, what about women who were working in a variety of fields, but considered themselves activists or culture developers, that sort of thing. I could easily have kind of gone through the book, which starts in the 17th century with a Shawnee chieftain and come to the end. But I think I wanted to focus primarily on activists. And, it may have to do with the fact I'm teaching this class on American women in activism. And we have talked so much about Madge Breckenridge, Nisba Breckenridge, Elizabeth Faust, and some of those women that I was impressed all over again with the kind of tirelessness and selflessness that some of these women involved themselves, gave over to do what they did.
Okay, if I could follow up, who did you have to leave out? Probably because of space or because there were too many women from a particular time period.
Well, I had to leave out the Todd sisters, Mary Todd and Emily Todd Helm. I left out Anne Braden and her ancestor, Anne Pogue McGinty. Left out the young slave girl, Matilda Threlkeld, who was, one of the first slaves to come into Western Kentucky, even before the Jackson Purchase was kind of part of Kentucky. Well, left out the visual artist, Enid Yandel, the writers, Harriet Simpson Arnaud. So there are women in many fields that I left out. I originally had a visual artist in the talk, and I decided, no, I think I'm going to pull out the visual artist and put some politicians in there. Give the politicians their due.
We had somebody who wanted to know how long you worked on the book.
How long did we work on the book? Oh my goodness. The book appeared in 2015. I think we submitted the manuscript in 2014. I think we got all of the essays in 2013. And finding writers for the essays was not the easiest thing to do. I think we probably started, Tom, you can correct me. Did we start in 2010, maybe?
I think we did. I think we did.
Yeah, 2010 or 2011. So it took us about 5 years. And, there were some essays that we had hoped to include in the book that for some reason or another did not make it into the book. For example, we had a great essay working on home extension agents in Western Kentucky, and the writer wasn't able to finish that. And that was one that was kind of close to my heart as a Western Kentuckian. And knowing, of course, the home extension agent in my county, Caldwell County, I definitely wanted to have that, but that didn't come through. We also had an essay running. Somebody was working on an essay about Rosemary Clooney. That one didn't come through. That happens. There was an essay on a writer that did not come through. So, we adjusted. We got other essays, but it took us about 5 years.
I know you've got someone, a particular activist that you most admire, and whether that's included in your presentation tonight or just personally, who do you most admire and why?
Well, I'm often asked, and I even ask my students, if you could have dinner with any 3 or 4 activists, who would you most want to have dinner with? Who would you most want to talk with? And I would so love to talk with Eleanor Roosevelt, not a Kentucky woman, but I so admire Eleanor Roosevelt for all of the kind of the chances she took, the things that she did. And, she really didn't want the limelight, but she was first lady. So she went kind of above and beyond in many ways what her husband could do as president. So Eleanor Roosevelt is somebody I would love to talk with. I admire her so much. And the other person is Ida B. Wells Barnett, absolutely fearless journalist who fought her entire life against lynching and fought against violence, of course, the violence that was directed toward her community, the Black community. And so Ida B. Wells Barnett, those would be 2 women I would love to, if I could sit down and talk with them, love to do that.
I really enjoyed this whole hour, and I'm glad you included our ham lady because she's a treasure for sure.
She is a treasure. She is. And I so wanted to highlight in the essay, and I talk about what she did to help revitalize Main Street, the importance of small towns, the Walmart effect on small towns, what has happened in rural America. And she really worked so hard with tourism in the Lakes area and in Princeton to bring tourists along, of course, with Adsmore, to bring tourists to Princeton. I think she's been so important to that effort. The Kentucky Women book is out there, so I hope you get to read it.
It is. We have a copy available at the McCracken County Public Library, both an ebook and the physical copy. So if anyone is interested in checking that out and you're in the area, you're more than welcome to.